All right, let's get started. You can keep putting in first job, worst job, whatever you want, and we'll keep the conversation going. If you weren't on the last call, I'm Adam. I'm our head of customer success at Pando. I'm here with Aaron Marshall, the VP of People at Oyster, and we're here to talk about feedback culture. Aaron, do you want to give a quick intro, who you are, why you do what you do?
Sure. Thanks, Adam. I'm Erin, as he said. I'm the VP of People at Oyster. Most of my career has been in talent acquisition, and I've been at Oyster about 3 years now. I'm leading the people team for almost a year. It's coming up quick. So that has been a unique and interesting transition and challenge, and feedback is always top of mind. So I'm excited to talk about it today.
That flew by a year
We're
already.
getting there.
Getting
We're
there.
getting there.
Well, what is,
August.
okay, yeah, we're getting there. What does feedback culture look like at Oyster today?
Yeah, we give a lot of regular feedback at Oyster. So I think there's a few different components to it. Employee engagement surveys are a big one. We do those 3 times a year, including a manager effectiveness survey. We use Slack for and have questions like we have a channel called Ask Leadership. And then, like, if we do a big launch on something, we'll have temporary ask channels where we encourage people to give feedback, ask pointed questions, challenge, all of that. We also use like core shout outs is what we call it in Slack. So there's kind of like a celebration praise channel. And we use continuous feedback through Pando. So we have like a pretty strong practice of asking for feedback following big launches. We have like Slack integrations that are like, hey, like if somebody gives a shout out, hey, we noticed you got feedback. Is that something you want to put into your tool, feedback tool? So we've kind of really built it into these different areas and ways of working. So it's a pretty big part of our culture. Um, and on top of that, transparency is one of our values. I probably should have written down the whole value word for word, but it's like something to do with transparency. I can't think of it off the top of my head. But I think that goes to we encourage questions and challenges from employees. We have a lot of outlets for that, both anonymous and otherwise. And we aim to answer them as transparently as possible. We have including, things including like transparent salary bands, transparent equity bands. All of that leads to and leads people to believe and like give feedback on all of these things. And then lastly, we're pretty intentional about actioning on feedback. So I know this is like a big area of opportunity for a lot of companies, but what we have been doing is being really intentional about what's the feedback that we've received, what can we commit to, what action plan can we create, and really tying that into our OKRs. So I'm happy to say that this first half, like we had 3 kind of plans of action tied into our OKRs for the year based on our engagement surveys, and we're able to deliver on those, which was really, I think, was really exciting for me, and also like reinforcing for staff to show the action that we're actually taking on the feedback that we're receiving.
Yeah, that's one of the things about engagement surveys is if you go 2 or 3 engagement surveys without actually completing, either taking action or committing to action, or without completing the actions that you committed to, you really start to wear away. I mean, probably not even 2 or 3. If you go like one time doing that, you start to wear away at the trust that people have. And so that's I'm glad you said that, because one of the questions that popped up in my head earlier was, how do you decide what to action? If you're getting feedback on every new program or whatever it is in these individual Slack channels, how do you decide what to action, and how do you communicate either that decision process or what people can expect to see actioned or not actioned ahead of time?
Yeah, I think it depends on the piece of feedback and like the area of feedback. I think in engagement surveys specifically, like you do have to kind of look at the bit, like zoom out a bit and do a bit of an analysis on what's like the impact of this feedback? Is it something that, if we deliver on it, it will, like, what will the impact of making a change or delivering something based on that feedback be? What's the population of people that it's going to impact? I think sometimes it is good to look at, like, is it going to impact just 2 people if we make this huge organizational change, or is it going to, 50% of the population? So I think having a clear kind of idea of that, and then also like being, in terms of like communicating, I think transparency is the best way to go. And, you will make, and we have made commitments to action that haven't come to fruition, that we haven't delivered on. And I think part of creating a culture of feedback is being vulnerable and admitting when you miss the mark, admitting when you make mistakes. And yeah, like I'm thinking of something like specific, you can't commit to actioning on every feedback, right? And right now we're in the process of updating our equity program, and there's a lot of questions and a lot of feedback and a lot of requests about that. And so, my commitment is I'm going to look at it in Q3 and I'll have an update in Q4. I don't know exactly what the answer is going to look like, but there's a lot of work to do behind the scenes, and we'll talk about it in Q4, and I will give an update at that point.
Speaking of behind the scenes, I see you have a guest behind the couch. We'll pop their head.
He might pop up soon. We'll see.
So that makes sense. And I think, transparency, ahead of time and transparency, as you go along, and what's going, what you're able to accomplish or not able to accomplish, or what are you even going to address versus not. And I think that's helpful because feedback, I think, organizationally can feel overwhelming when you have so many people with so many different perspectives. Often those perspectives are very firmly held and not emotional in any sort of negative connotation, but emotionally sort of charged when people share it, and sort of break down the barriers of fear to actually share feedback. And so if you can't action that, it can be challenging to have an environment where that person feels safe to give it, in the future. And so that transparency ahead of time makes sense. The transparency and the follow-up makes sense as well. So that makes sense organizationally. And then I suppose for the topic at hand, how does that translate into, effectively performance feedback? How does that translate into feedback between manager report up to their manager, cross-departmentally? How do you handle feedback in that way, or what culture are you developing around feedback when it comes to performance, either between manager and report, or peer to peer?
Great question. I think there's the unique sort of landscape to Oyster, but also I think a lot of companies are in relatively similar situations, in that we're a globally distributed company in 70-ish countries. I know that's not the norm, but there are, it's common for people to be in 10 countries, or so, like that. You see that more and more these days as everyone has more and more companies have gone remote. And that means there's a ton of cultural diversity in our organization. So one of the things that we have noticed is our staff and our leaders have defaulted to a culture of niceness, because I suspect, I don't 100% know why, but like, I suspect like a part of that is not really knowing how to navigate cultural differences. And people are really quick to share like positive praise. You did this amazing thing, or I did this one thing, when I look at my performance evaluation competency, I did this one thing really well, so I should be a 5 because, I did it one time and I did it really well. And it's led to some areas of, I would say, misalignment of expectations. So one of the things we talk a lot about at Oyster is there's actually a really great book called The Culture Map by Erin Meyer. And and it talks about the difference in communication styles culturally and the difference between high context and low context cultures. And you can kind of relate those to directness and indirectness. Or actually, sorry, the other way around, indirectness, where a high context culture tends to be much more indirect. They expect you to sort of read the room, if you will, have a lot of information that they're kind of pulling on. Whereas low context, which would be like, the United States falls very much on this spectrum, like really direct, say it like it is, deliver the feedback. So I think there's like, because of all the cultural differences and not really know it, like something's off, but I don't really know what it is and I haven't really dug into it, like people just default to being nice. So I think like for us, a big part of that is setting really clear expectations. Like as you asked about performance reviews. And I think the more well-defined competencies you can have, the better. If you can pull on a competency and use that language and those expectations to deliver constructive feedback, you're taking a step towards depersonalizing something, and towards like setting someone up for success, which I think can be a big, I don't know, a miss for people sometimes. It's like, you did this thing and I didn't wanted it to be different. But if you can depersonalize it and talk about, actually the expectation. Brene Brown says clear is kind. It's one of my favorite phrases. And the more clear those expectations and the definitions are, the better off you'll be.
When you're talking about nice before, are you talking about delivering ambiguous feedback because you're trying to do it in a nice way, or avoiding feedback entirely? What's the more common version of being nice as you described it?
I think the more common version is not surfacing areas of development or opportunity, either in the moment or, also humans have bad memories. And so being able to go back during performance review season and think of all the ways to improve, we have recency bias. So really not delivering it like in the moment, I think is what we see more commonly.
And what you mentioned Slack earlier. What are the more common sort of defaults to giving feedback? Do people default to written feedback because it's so distributed? Do people default to verbal? Or does it, I suppose probably the answer, does it just depend? What's your take?
Well, do you know what the love languages are? Do people know what the love languages are? 5 love languages. I kind of liken feedback to this, like to the love languages. There are different ways to give it and there are different ways to receive it. And we all have preferences when it comes to those things. So if you assume that somebody wants to give feedback, receive feedback the way that you like to either give it or receive it, you're already kind of putting yourself in on the back foot in that way. So the default is to ask how people like to receive feedback. So you have that context. So for me, anyone reporting to me, anyone around me knows that I like to receive written feedback. I don't want it in the moment unless I've specifically gone and asked for you. If you have something constructive, I'm open to it. And having that written feedback allows me to regulate my emotions when I get the feedback. Whereas some people can't, because some people can't do that in the moment. And if I'm caught off guard, vulnerably, like I have trouble regulating my emotions. So, so that's the way that I like to receive it. But so the default is to ask, like, how do you like to receive it? And I think that goes across the organization. So if I have a leader that I need to deliver feedback to, whether that's from my own personal experience of something that's happened or something I'm getting from other leaders in the organization, and it needs to be surfaced, I will default to asking how they like to receive it and letting them know that I have it. That said, that's like the ideal situation. And my like second sort of sort of point to check in on is like, what's the urgency of it? Is it real time? And would this person or this situation be better served by me writing it because we are in different time zones. We both have busy calendars. We aren't going to be able to connect. And so I will use that as like a check as well.
Yeah, I remember when I was getting management training. I think it was Life Labs Learning that was doing it. They talked about the micro ask. This was like 7, 8 years ago, something like that. And that always stuck with me in the micro ask being, hey, would you be open to receiving from some feedback? And then, how, right?
Yeah.
And Barb put this in the chat, but we actually we just released a meetings feature recently. And one of the meetings that we have, and there is a new hire check-in, which is really a chance for you to establish that in the beginning. It's like, how do you like to receive feedback is my report. And as your manager, let me share with you how I like to receive feedback. And it's a way to establish that relationship from the very beginning with the people that you're going to be interacting with on a regular basis, and then also have it, easily referenceable because you'll probably forget the first few times you exchange feedback with that person. And so you can go back and look in your notes and see what it is. But it's something that we had done at Pando before we had the meetings feature, and so it felt very natural to add it in. But yeah, like so the micro ask would be, okay, is now a good time or whatever it is, and then that feedback style is sort of typically more of a permanent, how they like to exchange feedback.
Yeah, I would say so.
Um, I think the other piece that you sort of started to touch on with the micro ask, with the sort of feedback exchange, uh, sort of, I don't know, style establishment is this idea, this concept of psychological safety, and it's something that you and I have talked about. And how do you, yeah, what is psychological safety? Actually, like, let's establish that. Particularly when it comes to feedback, what does psychological safety mean to you? Yeah, and how does it manifest there?
I think psychological safety is what it sounds like, creating a space for people to feel safe, to express opinions, to give feedback, etc. And I think the thing that I feel it's important to distinguish between is psychological safety and toxic positivity. I think there can be, and I have seen it manifest in ways where people only default to positive because they don't want to upset the other person. They think being psychologically safe is not delivering anything that could be construed as constructive or negative, because they value positivity over everything else. So I think there is a really big difference between the two. And yeah, in terms of how it manifests, at Oyster, I talked a little bit about, some of the ways that we have those open feedback channels where we encourage transparency. And I think, the things that we do like practically is are around acknowledging people, validating them, more like relationship analogies, right? Like things that you would do, and like in a relationship with somebody, like acknowledge their feelings and validate them, and really leading with the assumption that everyone is doing their best, and decentering yourself when you're receiving feedback or even thinking about giving feedback, I think are ways to create psychological safety.
Is it something that you have, like, is it a big hurdle when you bring on a new leader? Because presumably that it starts with the leader, with the manager, right? That creating that environment. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I imagine most of your training around this, if there is some internally, is with management or leadership, at probably all levels. Is that accurate? And if so, what is your sort of onboarding to this concept of psychological safety or feedback environment look like for new hires? Because I imagine it's not the same at all the companies that these people are coming from.
Yeah, definitely. I kind of smiled when you asked me about leaders and onboarding them. I think people come in with their own ways of, of working, of giving feedback, of all of those things. And a lot of how we train people is like through their experience of working with us. So people might come in with one way of doing things and then they'll quickly be unsuccessful because, they don't work here at Oyster. Like if you come in like a bowl in a china shop and you've got, a lot of direct feedback and this and that, like it's not going to work. So you kind of like learn through the tribe, if you will. That said, we have developed training for our staff, which I think is really important, and it speaks to really level setting, like what is feedback. So it's not currently part of our onboarding program, and that's where we're headed eventually. And it will be for everyone because we want to create an even playing field for giving and receiving feedback. It's not just manager to direct report or manager to peer. It's definitely direct report to manager or direct report to, or like a peer to peer, at the individual contributor level. So there's a few things that we're specifically developing, and they're launching in July actually. So it's kind of new for us. One is around productive conflict, because like I said, that's an area of opportunity for us. So what does it mean to disagree with somebody? How do you create safety in that? What happens if you don't agree with somebody? Like if you don't disagree, like what are the risks to either your own work productivity, the company's goals and mission, et cetera? So that's one that we have in the works. And then obviously just giving and receiving feedback in general, kind of the table stakes of that and some of the stuff we've already talked about. Yeah.
So you're developing a framework or basically a framework that people can use to like work through not just not just how to give the feedback, but whether to give the feedback and what happens if they don't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Interesting.
exactly. Yeah, and it's going to be tied to our competency of collaboration. So we're calling it like collaboration, but it's kind of all of these, communication tools underneath collaboration. And that way we can say confidently, like, you know how to do this. We've talked about it. We have a cultural norm, an expectation, and now we can give you feedback on that if we need to, hold you accountable.
I have a follow-up question, but first I want to go to Elizabeth's question. I don't know if you saw that in chat already, but what are the recommended, or what do you recommend in scenarios where managers may have damaged the psychological safety by providing poor feedback experiences, in feedback and performance reviews? They're inconsistent, potentially. How can those managers repair or rebuild that trust?
Mm. Good question. I think that takes like some time and some coaching, obviously, and like awareness, but I would honestly start with vulnerability and admitting and acknowledging the impact of the review on the other person or the impact of the way that the feedback landed for the other person, and the experience that caused them to have. I think starting with that, like leading with that, just saying like, hey, I'm aware that this didn't go well. This felt inconsistent to you. I hear that. I'm gonna improve. Like, yeah, like that must have been hard, and I'm going to improve. um, is a really good way. And then I think also one of the things we didn't talk about yet, which I think is important to touch on, is really how to build trust and transparency through positive feedback. I know I've kind of been like saying, you can't just be nice, it can't all be positive. But the truth is, like, people want to be praised for what's going well. And if you notice, like if you can look at somebody's performance, like let's say, somebody delivered a presentation and they just, they did such a great job and you were really impressed by something, like make an effort to say, okay, these 3 things went really well. Like here's how you nailed that. You will begin to rebuild trust with that person as well. And then that person will want to do those things again next time. So using your positive praise in a way that influences the behaviors that you want, if that makes sense.
Yeah, we often talk about very well structured feedback in terms of constructive, but having well
Mhm.
structured praise is also really vital to make sure that people can know what they need to continue to doing or to do rather than just saying, hey, that was great, right? Which is
Right.
not,
It's like, that was great. And here's why. Here's
yeah.
3 things I loved about that. Here's what really worked for me. The other framework that I really like for that is like, and this is also does have a constructive element to it, but it's without being, fully just like you didn't nail that, is what I loved about that was, and what I wanted more of, what I would have loved to see more of was. So they probably did a little bit of that, but you can kind of, say, hey, I saw this. Like, I know you've got it in you. Let's see some more.
Mhm. And we've talked about that, or I've talked about it with other folks, I should say, the general we, there's the feedback sandwich is a feedback method that is, yeah, I would say, controversial maybe. And I think what you're describing is the open-faced feedback sandwich, which is really appropriate in coaching conversations, not necessarily delivering critical performance, overall thematic performance, conversations. If somebody's struggling to deliver on expectations, then you're not going to use any sort of sandwich, open or closed. But in coaching, on a meeting or coaching in, a presentation or whatever it may be, like there are going to be a mix of things. There are going to be things that they should continue doing, and I think some things that they should change. And so the open face feedback sandwich, makes a lot of sense in that case.
Yeah, the
Um,
feedback sandwich, I feel like the feedback sandwich has been debunked a little bit. Like, I feel like it's very confusing for people. The actual constructive, what can I do differently, gets lost in that. And, I mentioned the culture map earlier. Like, what she talks about is that works really well in like indirect cultures where there's a lot of nuance and a lot of subtlety, and where they can't really process very direct feedback. So just something to be mindful of. Like, if you're mostly working in more direct cultures like the United States as an UK as an example, like, it's not the most helpful to have a sandwich.
and I think, personally, I'm the opposite, where if I get a sandwich, all I focus on is the bad and I ignore the good or assume that it's disingenuous.
Hmm.
So there's that.
Interesting.
Oh, interesting. We'll talk about that later.
We'll
Um,
unpack that later.
yeah, that'll be our after hours conversation for everybody to join. So one question for Elizabeth, I'm wondering, does this manager want to rebuild, or do you need to have a coaching conversation with this manager that they do need to rebuild psychological safety?
I
I
guess
think
that
it's,
depends on.
oh,
Go ahead.
sorry. I was just going to say, I think it's a bit of a mix. As was already mentioned, we kind of have a culture of niceness over direct and kindness. And so sometimes it can be inconsistent and uncomfortable. And so we have some who are definitely shying away from that discomfort. And then we have some who want to lean in. So it's definitely a mix.
So I'm curious then, Aaron, how do you, or do you have thoughts on how to coach a manager to being sort of acknowledging that they've broken this psychological safety or damaged it at least, and how do you communicate the importance of that?
I guess it would depend on how that was coming to me. Like, how would I know if it was, for me, I'm sensitive to taking one person's um, experience and making it everyone's experience. But so I would be curious, like, how did that come to me? What do I know about it? Has it been validated in other ways? Um, and generally, like, I lean towards always having the conversation. Like, that's just my default, but that, you have to decide what works for you and your culture as well. It's an interesting place to be in a culture, like the one that we have, where we default to niceness, to be the person who defaults to always giving the feedback. But it works. That would be my approach, is, yeah, if I validated it and I don't feel like it's just one person's opinion, and it's been observed in different areas, I would definitely have the coaching conversation with them. And I wonder if it would be, in any part of your managerial competencies, your leadership competencies, right? Like I mentioned earlier, we do a manager effectiveness survey, so we can see, like, that's another validation point for how people are leading their teams. So we can see if there are themes emerging.
Aubrey, is your question answered? Do you want to jump in here?
I have to say I was reading something, and so I didn't tune in for the last 30 seconds or so. But this was more of just a thought slash, I don't know. Yeah, I guess potential conversation is just, yeah, how do we hold them accountable? Because it is such a large job of the managers to own this feedback, and I feel like it's typically just like an afterthought, and they don't think of this as like a core part of their role. So my comment was a little bit more of a personal reflection, but also kind of just sharing broadly. Yeah.
And I've
Yeah.
seen, oh, go ahead, Aaron.
No, you go ahead, Adam.
I have a follow-up on that, a potential addition. And then Aaron, take it where you will. But I've seen a lot lately where management responsibilities have been, on the surface eliminated in favor of having more managers do more individual contributor type work. And the justification there, has been that businesses need more doers than leaders, and budgets are tight and this and that. And so my observation has been over the last really 2 years has been a reduction in the amount of time that managers are given to manage. And so that's sort of existential might be a stretch, but that's the other impact of that is like, what do we hold them accountable to when in those cases where we're asking managers to take on essentially more direct contribution and saying that we don't need, quote unquote professional managers, which is something that I've heard a lot of recently.
That's so interesting. I think you might have a little bit of bias in, like, you're working with smaller, probably faster growing startups. So there's that. I think that's really true in, like, sort of smaller startup-y companies. But yeah, I mean, Barb put it in the chat here. I think it's deciding as an organization, is this something that you value highly enough to put into your performance framework and define at the different levels and set expectations for, and then hold accountable for. That's where I would start, which is the heaviest place to start, but also, but we'll scale and deliver the most, I think, most value.
Yeah. I would say it is a lot. It's not just smaller, it's a lot of smaller. But I've heard it at, larger-ish companies as well. At least a certain percentage of someone manager's job should be direct contribution, and which I think is there's some percentage for sure. But the idea of not having professional managers has been something that I've just sort of heard in the ethos and then observed with a handful of customers.
Yeah, it's a luxury. Just having professional managers is such a luxury these days.
Yeah.
I've been at big companies where they have them, so that's why I'm like, well, I do know they're still out there in the world. I've been in smaller companies for a longer period of time, so.
What else? Other questions from the crew, or what else, Aaron, would you want to share, with the audience here around feedback culture, driving, delivering, any cautions that you want to share with folks?
Any departing thoughts? Hadn't really prepared that. I mean, I think that there's like this sort of like meta awareness of the diversity in your organization, the differences that exist within your organization, and starting with that always will lead to better outcomes, in my opinion. So, just acknowledging that, I said it earlier, like decentering yourself, acknowledging other people's experiences, trying to be as objective as possible when making decisions about feedback, will lead to better outcomes.
Makes sense. Any other questions from the audience here, either in chat or verbally, for Erin? All right, I have one more, Erin.
Okay.
I took a note and wanted to come back to
Okay.
it. How much, you talked about, making these activities part of the rubric. Are you doing like a count? Would it make sense to do like a count of, number of pieces of feedback that you gave to your manager and like have that as a metric or at least something to reference? Where does gamification come in and like making the behavior change around that upward feedback that you were talking about earlier? Or does it? Yeah.
That's a good question. I haven't really thought about that before. I do like the idea of challenging yourself to give a specific amount of feedback either each week or each month. So maybe that's like 3 pieces of feedback a week or something, just for as a leader, like, dispersed amongst your team or to your manager or whatever. If you're committed to having a culture of feedback, which I'm assuming people on this call are. But that's a good question, and I don't have an answer, but I like the idea.
Yeah, I just some people or some things do well with gamification. And that could be one of them is like building the muscle of feedback. And what I can like the concern that I have that I'd be curious your thoughts on is it takes away from the impact of the feedback, at least in the beginning. Like maybe people are just, spraying out feedback and it's not as meaningful. Maybe that's not a real risk. But that would be
No, I
my
think it is a
concern.
risk.
And
No, I
then
absolutely think it's a risk. I mean, my mind immediately went to it's only going to be positive and praise, and like, how do you influence any change? Like we already kind of see this with getting feedback from peers and stuff in the tool. And you go to do a performance review and you look through all the feedback they've gotten over the last 6 months, 3 months, whatever, and it's just all lots of great accomplishments, which are helpful, but not necessarily going to help you with if you're trying to influence change or, give constructive feedback.
right. Yeah. And I would think
So
of getting comment, yeah, even constructive and saying, hey, at least, one or some percentage of the feedback, and then have that, could you put that as part of your rubric and make really clear expectations, starting with managers, but then eventually for individual contributors. So that's the culture that you're trying to build.
Mm.
Or is that just too wild?
It feels a little wild.
A little wild. Okay.
I don't know if I can check all those boxes.
We'll table it.
But,
We'll table it.
Yeah.
Okay. That was my last question. I had forgotten that I wanted to come back to that. So thank you. Any other questions or thoughts from the crew before we break before our next session?
I do have a
Okay.
quick, well, I have a
good.
question. It may not necessarily be quick, and so maybe it's not fair to ask it in the last 3 minutes. But I know quality of hire, and Erin, I think your background is in talent acquisition. I know quality of hire tends to be a pretty big topic these days amongst people leaders. I'm curious if you're doing anything to relate kind of the performance management and feedback circles back to kind of like the initial journey of getting them into the funnel in the first place, and kind of tracking that feedback with the initial hiring process.
We're like, the short answer is we're not. I think that you need really good tooling for that, and tooling that talks to each other in order to do that, or resources of humans to actually go and do that analysis. And it hasn't been a priority for us. Where we have done it is more ad hoc, particularly around if somebody comes with a performance concern. We've gone back to the hiring process and looked at like, were these things questioned, in the process evaluated? Could you have, caught them ahead of time? If they were evaluated, like what's changed? Like, are you doing your job setting expectations? So that's where we've been able to link the two to date. But we haven't done that work yet on quality of hire. It's a little bit of a hot potato, if I'm honest. Yeah, I'd be curious. Are you guys doing work on it right now?
Okay, so I have an ulterior motive in asking this question. So I'm not in the people space. So yeah, I was just curious to kind of get your feedback and thoughts on it. Just doing research.
Cool. Cool.
I have one other quick question as well. I think typically this idea of a culture of feedback is usually driven from the HR space. I'm curious, maybe at least at Oyster, how it shows up in maybe your leadership team and kind of reinforcing and showing what this looks like. If there's any specific mechanisms that you guys have put in place to make sure that feedback is a kind of a thread that weaves through either conversations or all hands meetings or like, all those different venues that it could show up.
Yes. I think that for us, Slack has been a big one. So like we have an Ask Leadership channel, as I mentioned. And so the leaders, what you see there is them being really practiced at receiving feedback, acknowledging it, and responding to it. So I think that creates just a little more of the psychological safety and just the like space for giving feedback. Yeah, that's kind of where we've seen it the most in terms of like all hands. We're really like, our CEO loves the engagement survey, so we talk a lot about the engagement survey and we share that feedback, and we're really transparent about it, and what we're trying to do about it as well.
And I'm realizing now that's exactly what you started this conversation with feedback surveys, asking leadership, launches.
Yeah.
Okay, so I apologize. I went back to my
But no,
notes.
it's full circle. I mean, it might not have been
bit.
clear. Yeah, no, it's full circle, and that's really how we've done it. And there's always room for improvement, right? Awesome. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Okay, thanks, y'all. We will resume in 14 minutes. Really appreciate the engagement. And Erin, thank you very much for joining. Thank you for your wisdom. One more thing.
Well, somebody wrote in the chat. I just want to make sure they got their answer before the thing closed about a book that I mentioned. The book that I mentioned was The Culture Map by Erin Meyer, Erin Meyer. Just want to make sure everybody got that.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
All right. Thanks, y'all.
Take care. Thank you.